Alright, this round is now being recorded.
I approve. Just for legal reasons. Huh?
We're only going to put your timer down there when I speak. Unless we, can we use our phones?
I don't mind.
For timing? Yes.
You can use it anyway. Oh yeah, what are the rules regarding POIs for this round?
Somewhere in the
Sorry,
POIs?
because of the different format of
Yeah,
knowledge.
it is. Let's see, no POIs in the rebuttal. And the first and last minute of each constructive speech is protected.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
for first minute and last minute, you
Alright. And are there
can't, no standing up.
points of order in the last speech?
Anytime.
Okay.
Let's just make sure. I want to say yes at any. POs are allowed and will stop time.
Okay. Oh.
So this is actually slightly less crazy Oregon rules, because actual Oregon has no POLs.
Yeah.
So we called the round slightly less crazy Oregon.
Okay, so is everyone ready? Do you need a pen or something, Artem?
Just throwing in.
No, just don't.
Okay, so let's get started. Because my partner and I stand for freedom of speech, we are proud to affirm today's resolution. In the U.S., school administrators should not be allowed to censor student-run newspapers. Before we go into more detail about why we're affirming today, I'd like to thank everyone here for making this debate possible and jump right into some resolutional analysis. Now, most of the terms in today's resolution are pretty self-defining, but we'd like to clarify that we are going to be running this round as a value round and not as a policy. And why we are going to be doing this is because there is no real actor that can truly institute a plan that would completely prevent school administrators from censoring these student-run newspapers. The U.S. federal government doesn't have control of the education system. The states do, and we don't have the power to fiat all 50 states as the affirmation, so thus we need to default to a value. So that's what we're going to be doing, and we're going to be looking at this from a holistic way, but this shouldn't be a major problem because all of the contentions should still apply. So with that, we'd like to clarify that this round should be weighed on net benefits, so whichever side better proves to you that their advocacy overall benefits the world deserves to win this round. So continuing on, our first contention is that overall, this is going to be promoting a better student perspective. Subpoint A is that there will be more communicating with each other. When you take away the censorship that is suppressing the students of these student-run newspapers, we're making it so that they're better able to help themselves. They're better able to communicate with each other because they're working on their own writing skills in a way that helps them develop speaking skills and knowledge of the world better overall. In addition, it improves the likelihood of them researching political things or other such projects, because when they know that their piece isn't going to be censored, they're more likely to research something that could be considered controversial. This makes it so that students get to know more about the world around them and promotes an overall better era of education. Yes?
Alright, so how does the status quo right now, or how does censoring a student newspaper, how does that prevent communication between students?
I'm not saying that it completely prevents communication between students. All I'm saying is that if we were to prevent this censorship, that would by default improve the student communication. We aren't saying that there's a complete harm, but what we are saying is that we will improve the situation, which does uphold net benefits. Now, continuing on to our subpoint B here, that's that students are going to be more dedicated. When they know that the work that they put into their project is going to be published as they wrote it, and it won't be censored, that makes it so that they will be more likely to actually do their work and put hard work into what they're doing. That's overall going to improve their speaking and communicating skills and make it so that they are more incentivized to work hard, once again improving their educational abilities. Subpoint C is that we will be improving the legitimacy of these newspapers themselves, because when you have teachers that are censoring these newspapers, they are allowed to bias them to their own opinions, and we're making it so that the student-run newspapers truly are student-run. That's what Shay and I are saying here. We are saying that these student-run newspapers throughout the United States should remain student-run because that is what best promotes the student perspective. Contention 2 is on the freedom of speech. Subpoint A is that we're improving the quality of life for all these students because we're giving them their rights back. Now, we see that right now, these students are being dehumanized because they are having their freedom of speech taken away. The freedom of speech is our First Amendment right and one of our most basic rights of all. In fact, the freedom of speech is a prerequisite to all other rights in the Bill of Rights and just in life in general. Because if you aren't able to talk, then it is much harder for you to actually protest and gain an ability to develop your own rights in other ways. The subpoint B here is that we're going to be promoting independence. People will be more free thinking because they know that what they're publishing is what's actually being thought by these writers, and we're making it so that they're more likely to promote their own ideas. We're seeing that we will be getting rid of these teacher opinions that can currently be influencing these newspapers. We're going to be making it so that more of these students who have these ideas that they want to publish but could be considered more controversial, they're going to be able to publish their ideas. This gets them more involved in the political arena and gets them to choose sides and learn more about the issues so that they can truly develop ideas and opinions on these controversial issues. Now, subpoint C here is that censorship is cyclical and builds upon itself. When we look at the censorship and system and how exactly it works, as soon as you start to censor people in one thing, it becomes harder for them to protest and gain back more of their rights. You can keep censoring, and then you gain the ability to censor more and more and more. And that's part of what we're protesting today, because even though the censorship of student-run newspapers isn't the biggest of issues that we could be debating today, thank you for this topic, Artem, what we are seeing here is that any censorship at all can develop into a much bigger one, and that's what we're protesting. We're protesting censorship as an idea, and that's why what we're seeing here is that the freedom of speech is the main advocacy of the affirmation, while the negation is going to have to take a stance on the approval of censorship. Now, the third and final contention today is on incentives in regards to publishing and freedom of speech. Subpoint A is that this freedom of speech is going to be self-regulating, because even though these students will now be able to publish what they choose in these student-run newspapers that aren't going to be censored, they're going to be regulating themselves, because most of these students know that what they're thinking is actually can be more controversial. They may not want to publish something if they think that it wouldn't go over well with the other students. So this leads us to subpoint B here. What we're seeing right now in the status quo is that choice is completely eliminated. We're putting students into this situation where they have the ability to write for a newspaper, but they don't always have the ability to write what they want. We're taking away their ability to choose what is controversial and what is not. We're, instead of giving them an idea and instead of having them decide for themselves, we're having one individual, one school administrator decide for them. When instead what we want them to do, we want them to be able to choose for themselves whether they publish these pieces or not, because that improves their education, and that then lets them learn what society as a whole is thinking, so that improves their ability to gauge incentives in the world overall. What we're going to be seeing here is that we will be leading directly into our subpoint C, which is promoting a better understanding of incentives and public opinion. This makes it so that students are better able to gauge the atmosphere and the political climate of areas, which makes them more informed about what's going on overall and improves their quality of life and ability to write and speak publicly. So for all these reasons, because we're improving student perspective, increasing freedom of speech, and helping students learn more about incentives, my partner and I are proud to affirm today and urge you to do the same.
Good?
Yeah.
Alright, you guys ready?
Yeah.
What I think we'll find in the round is that freedom of speech is not applicable to every single thing in society. And I'm going to dive into this, but before I'd just like to say that yes, we do agree to the value of net benefits, but as you'll see when I get onto parts of my case, is that we give a particular significance to the idea of what an institution should be striving for, whether that institution be the schools, whether that institution be the United States, and that is something really to weigh in net benefits, because an institution, say, like a school, doesn't want to doesn't have that institutional goal to try to save as many lives as possible or something like that. It has the goal to try to increase as much education as possible and help as many people. So we see different institutions have different goals, and that's going to come in as kind of as a filter when we look at what net benefits is. So with that, I'll go on to first the affirmative case. So first he says that you're better able to communicate. But the improvement of communication is small because you can still write in other forums. So what I mean here is that these kids who write in the school newspaper are choosing one certain forum to write to spread their message, but they still can write on any other thing, and they still have the freedom of speech in that means. What it means is that they can still communicate, they can still talk, they can still exercise their speaking skills, exercise their writing skills. They still have other ways to do. They still have other ways to do that, even if school censorship does censor some articles. On top of that, remember that they're not censoring all articles, which means that it is a very, very, very small part of communication skills at all that is limited. So you shouldn't be weighing this much in the round. You talk about how they're more dedicated, but they can be dedicated just as much to just different aspects of school. Instead of doing something that the school might deem censorship worthy, the student can talk about something else, and dedicate themselves to something else that would be just as good. Yes.
Okay, so you said that they have other methods of writing in other places where they can write. Would you say that a political Facebook post has as much legitimacy as a political newspaper article?
I think that they can use different newspapers. They can use anything like that, but they don't have to use the newspaper that has the school's name on top of it. So even if a Facebook post doesn't, a Facebook post I think could reach more people than the newspaper reaches. I mean, who reads school newspapers? Like parents, right? So you could reach more people, and it would be more effective freedom of speech and more effective communication. So I started to jump around, but I'm going to go over to the Nate case, and then I'll hit these last two contentions. So on the Nate case, a very important argument is that in the United States we have certain we don't just look at the Constitution, we don't just look at freedom of speech as the end all for every single thing we talk about rights. And we have agreed societal mechanisms. We have things that influence society but are not in the Constitution. For instance, we have the Castle Doctrine. For instance, we have things like at school, teachers become the essential parents of kids. And for instance, we have schools which are totally separate from society and don't abide by all these rules. Also, the Constitution is already restricted, so the freedom of speech can be restricted, and we can still have a legitimate society. The EPA is an institution that covers state policies. However, it is still an institution that is agreed upon in society and that is still good and that can still be deemed good for society. On top of that, on the first Wednesday of the presidency of George Washington, he made a cabinet, which in the Constitution he has no power to give. But we agreed that there are some limitations to the Constitution where we can, in the means of a better society, not just listen to the Constitution. So why does this matter in the debate round? It matters because when you look at schools aren't restricted by the same means of freedom of speech that other places are. So while society's goal may be to uphold rights like freedom of speech, the goal of a school, its institutional legitimacy, is to provide the best education environment for its students as possible. And the role of schools who foster this environment means that you're going to limit freedoms in some way. For instance, you can't cuss out your teachers. For instance, schools do not allow you to wear shirts with Nazi symbols, alcohol symbols, marijuana symbols, or any other drug symbols. What that means is that schools limit these freedoms in order to achieve this institutional legitimate goal of education. On top of that, they limit privacy. When you agree to sign in the school parking lot, and you sign a paper that says that you agree that they can search your car. Also, when you put your stuff in school lockers, you give up your right to privacy in that case. What we see is that the schools essentially operate under a means separate from just freedom of speech because they have a goal different from just the operation of society, that is to ensure rights and ensure our society operates. That goal is just to achieve the institutional legitimacy of a better environment for education. So with that, I'll move on to the last two contentions, and I'll take your point.
So if, as the affirmation, we prove that freedom of speech for these student-run newspapers upholds education, don't we therefore uphold the greatest net benefit for these learning institutions?
Well, basically, I do think that yes, you should link to net benefits to education in schools, and yeah, sure. If you can win that argument, then you have a strong case. Alright, so then on the second contention, he says that they're giving students more freedom of speech. However, we're restricting, not eliminating their freedom of speech. On top of that, students may use different forums to write, as I've already said. What that means is that the goal of education can be achieved better by having this censorship. You can also achieve the goal of education for students by having them still allowed to write in different places. So you're still achieving freedom of speech. Then he talks about how censorship is cyclical. However, limiting forms of censorship is not cyclical, because just because you can't yell fire in a crowded theater doesn't mean that you don't have that your right to yell fire in other places is limited. So you can still have that right to say. Oh, this is what I think about fire, and you can still have your right to say, oh, I think I should be allowed to yell fire in a crowded theater. You just can't do it in that forum. On top of that, censorship in school in one institution doesn't mean that where censorship already exists for things like privacy and things like clothes and things like cussing at your teachers isn't going to cause any more censorship. Then on the third contention of incentives, apply the same argument about forums and about forums and about how they can still exercise their education. Then he's going to on the idea of self-regulation. The idea is that censorship. The idea here is that self-regulation doesn't apply to those other aspects where that kid can still write, even if it did apply to this scenario. Thank you.
Please. Was there supposed to be another minute to that speech?
7, 8, 8, 8.
Yeah, I have another.
Do you want to take another minute? Feel free.
Sure, I'll take another minute.
Here.
I would love another minute. All right.
Well, 1 sec. Okay, screw it. Time is not working. Just go.
All right. All right. So one more minute. That's gonna be funny on the tape. All right. So then what I talked about as being an important aspect of our case is that this censorship having this censorship in place can be good for this creating an educational environment. So just to give a few examples of that, articles that critique teachers, articles that take a specific edge and target students are perfectly permissible, or target specific people are perfectly permissible in a professional newspapership means, but those aren't permissible in a school means where those could harm education. Also, attacking things that could harm education. Attacking teachers as well is another means. So personal attacks like that are examples where you're harming education and where it would then therefore be good for the school to have its ability to limit some forms of freedom of speech and apply that to schools as well. Also, the examples I already gave should be extended to exercising those like Nazi symbols and alcohol in the newspaper as well. So for those reasons, I say on this term, strongest negation. Thank you.
Okay, so this time thing is totally different.
Also 8 minutes. Also 8 minutes.
Yes. I think so.
Yeah, it is. Just
Okay, cool.
Okay. So, I don't believe they actually had any contentions of their own. If I'm mistaken, sorry, but I'm pretty sure I'll cover everything when I go over the refutations to our case. So the first contention that we brought up here is that not being allowed to censor would promote better student communication and promote better student perspectives. And Daniel came up here today and gave you 3 sub-points. Subpoint A was that we facilitate communication and discourse, and we provide a safe space, a safe atmosphere where they can exercise their freedom of belief, freedom of speech. And they basically came up here and respond to this sub-point by saying that, oh no, improvement in communication is just very small and very minimal because you can still use other forms and you can write anything you want in other forms. You just can't write articles for something with the school name on it. Now I have 2 responses to this. My first response is that, first of all, regardless of whether or not the improvement of communication is small, it's still there. It's small, but it's still there. My second response is simply that we shouldn't compromise the integrity of a publication just because we assume students can use other forms. And Daniel said this in a POI, but we often see that newspapers are the most legitimate forms in which students can actually exercise their freedom of speech and write articles and express their opinions, because now we see that in an academic forum, we actually demand rigorous research. We demand full analysis. We demand students to actually think through what they're going to write, what they're going to publish. Whereas on Facebook, I can easily just go up there and say, wow, I think the Tea Party sucks. And that won't be necessarily the best exercise of my freedom of speech. That won't necessarily challenge me to actually see how I can defend my personal opinions. That won't have any of the academic benefits that an academic forum such as a student-run publication offers. We cite newspapers in the round. We don't cite Facebook. So moving on, and the third response is that we shouldn't politicize student activities. Now, something that I really want to focus on is that the negation came up here and told you that students shouldn't write their opinions on something with the school name on it. And now what we see there is that we highly politicize the student activities. It becomes a matter of school reputation, not a matter of the students themselves. And once it becomes about the school and not the students expressing themselves, that completely delegitimizes the entire activity in and of itself and violates its very objective. And so let's go on to subpoint B, which is that we have more dedicated students. And Danny came here and told you that we increase the likelihood of quality improvement in writing because students now must invest their own interests. Students can choose what they want to write about. Students can explore their passions, explore their areas of interest through student publications. And the response is by saying that, oh no, students can dedicate themselves to other aspects of school. They can talk about something that's not going to be censored. But that's fundamentally flawed, we see, because once we tell students, oh no, you can't explore this interest, but you can go explore this other interest, we deny that student what possibly could be an integral part of their identity. So if the student is super passionate about something, the student is totally emotionally and mentally invested in a cause, and we tell that student, no, you can't explore that cause, you can't spread that cause to your peers, you can't discuss that with your peers because we're going to censor you. What does that do to this student? We deny them, we reject their identity as a student, as a human being, and that's inherently dehumanizing. And so let's go over our third and final subpoint to this contention, which is that we improve the legitimacy of the activity. And I already touched on this before. We have to preserve the opinions of the student, we have to publish everything as is, and we see that censorship is inherently insidious because it denies the student the exploration of their very passions, and it undermines what ought to be the mission of schools itself. And once again, we cannot politicize student activities. It's anti-progressive. And they basically didn't really respond to this point. It's a drop point, so we can extend that across the flow. And we see that we have to, which is key because we have to improve the legitimacy of such publications. We have to actually encourage these students to actually write articles, to write opinion op-eds, to write things that are accurate, to write things that are educational, and the only way to do that is via an academic forum. You can't necessarily do the same things on Facebook as you could in a student-run newspaper. That being said, let's go on to our second contention, which is basically freedom of speech. And our subpoint A was that freedom of speech is a prerequisite to all other rights. And so the negation came up here and told you that the First Amendment is already restricted. You can't yell fire, and they brought up the example of how you can't yell fire in a theater because you put people in harm's way, and that schools operate outside the freedom of speech. The goal is to have better education. And like I've already said time and time again, an academic forum is the ultimate path to journalistic and personal education. We see that academic forums demand rigorous research. We see that academic forums hold students to a higher standard than any forum such as Facebook would. And we see that once students are held to these higher standards, they're forced to evaluate their own opinions, forced to consider other opinions, other challenging opinions, and it's kind of like debate, this activity itself, where we're forced to consider both sides. And when you're writing an academic forum, that's exactly what students have to do. They have to consider all sides to their story, all sides to their opinion, and that's the only way to education. Whereas on Facebook, like the negation suggests, all you can do is say, oh, here's my opinion, and I'm going to be stubborn and just say that's my opinion, and if you comment on it, I'm going to delete it. Well, that's not necessarily the case with student-run publications, and when we see school newspapers beginning to censor student publications, we see that that's it's a violation of the students' right to having a more educational experience within the school itself. And so if the school's one and only goal, one and only duty is to promote education, what they should be doing is allowing students to explore their own interests, and they shouldn't be saying, no, your interests aren't valid because we think it's not valid. And so moving on, our subpoint B is basically that we promote independence. Students can choose what they want to do. And if we see that once you censor newspapers, once we say you can't write about this topic of interest, or you can't write about that topic, we see that students aren't truly independent. They're dependent on what their superiors tell them what to do. And so when students must rely on some authority figure with some arbitrary censorship rules, we see that that's definitely not going to help education at all. And that kind of ties into our subpoint C to this contention, which is that censorship is cyclical. And so the question we really have to ask here today is, what is censorship really? And now we can arguably say that the objective of censorship is to avoid public backlash. Yet, once we label something as potentially offensive, that's where the bright line quickly diminishes dramatically with each and every topic that's censored. And so we see that there is no bright line to what can be censored and what can't be censored. And so obviously we see that if a student writes a personal attack on a teacher, that's not going to be allowed. There are rules in student publications that check against such abuse of freedom of speech. There are already things, we see that First Amendment rights, as the affirmation, we're not saying that the First Amendment right is all true and all great and there is nothing wrong with it. We do see that there are limitations to First Amendment rights, and so when we allow students to write, we see that the self-regulation comes into play right there, which is part of our third contention. But we also do see that students won't be flagrantly abusing their freedom to speech as the negation would suggest. And so going back to the bright line argument, we see that they basically respond to this by saying that, oh no, you can't yell fire in a theater, but you can yell fire in other places. I didn't really get that analogy in the firstly, and secondly, that analogy isn't really relevant because we see that yelling fire in a public place where you can put people in danger is clearly wrong, and that's a clear limitation to the freedom of speech, which still applies in journalistic publications. We're not saying that you can just write whatever you want in a student-run publication because there is no censorship. It's self-regulating, which brings me straight to my third and final contention, which is incentives. And so the subpoint A was basically the self-regulating nature of the freedom of speech. And so when we see that students are publishing their own opinions, and let's say that opinion is slightly offensive, well, then we see that the public reactions to that opinion will actually teach the student and will educate the student on what the true nature of bigotry really is, and what being a journalist is all about, where you can't necessarily just resort. Was that 7 minutes? Okay. And for all these and many more, affirmation ballot is one. Thank you. I think your battery is like broken. I don't know.
Is everyone ready?
Yeah.
Alright, I'll first move on to the affirmative case in order, then the negation case in order. Ready? Alright. So let's begin. First, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out here and making this round possible. First, the first affirmation contention about promoting a better student perspective. Now, the main benefit they're trying to claim from this is saying that they're going to have better communication abilities, that this is still going to be an improvement. However, what you have to realize is that if students are not going to be writing from the newspapers, they're going to be writing to different forums. This was reiterated time and time with my partner, but it was misconstrued by the affirmation. Our argument is not that we should just have a bunch of students go on Facebook and Twitter and say a bunch of very one-liner things that aren't very important. Our argument is that students, if they're not writing for the school newspaper, they can, 1, start their own blogs, 2, they can go write for other local newspapers, and 3, they can even join other organizations that allow them to express their freedom of speech. For example, speech and debate. In speech and debate, you have different activities such as original oratory, where you can literally write about a speech of any problem you see fit in society. What we see is that they're trying to misconstrue today's situation by saying that other forms are bad. Other forms are perfectly good. They also promote good journalism, and they also promote students exercising this freedom of speech. I'll take your point.
Does the censorship of student-run school newspapers increase the likelihood of students getting involved in these other events?
I think to an extent it can, because when you talk about how students are basically going to have their opinion shit out, they're not going to be able to research certain things, those curious students will still want to research those activities, or research those topics, and for them to be able to express their opinion, they'd have to go to other forums. Therefore, yes, it would. Alright, now the second argument they bring up is about integrity, basically saying that the newspaper is only... The integrity of the newspaper is based on how rigorous students are researching. That Facebook isn't an apt example. Now, first of all, is that legitimacy, yeah, that includes how rigorous you research, but the legitimacy of the school newspaper also depends on the quality of journalism. Now, we see a very weak argument coming out from the last speaker about how these student-run newspapers are self-regulated and basically that they have all these rules to journalism. But however, what censorship can provide is that it ensures that certain newspaper articles can be censored if they don't promote ethical journalism. For example, I write for a school newspaper in California where basically it's completely student-run. That's how California law works. But at that same time, we still have a lot of articles being published that are not necessarily good journalism, so to say. They're not ethical because they're making up quotes, they're publishing misinformation. What we can do under a right to censorship is that prevent that from happening so students can develop good journalism skills. Now, this is also good because after they start writing for their school newspaper and they go to other forums where they have a more lenient right to freedom of speech, this means that they've already developed the necessary journalism skills and they can go research all the other topics they want. So in the long term, it's more better if we censor now and then allow them to basically publish whatever they want in the future, because if you aren't developing adequate journalism skills right now, that's very important for even maintaining the integrity of the newspaper. Furthermore, is that the integrity of the newspaper, a lot of the issues that students want to relate to, a lot of teachers want to talk about. For example, there are a lot of teachers who think that it's important that students know about teenage drinking, underage drinking, teenage drug use, which may seem as controversial topics, but the students and the teachers still share the same perspective, at which point none of those articles would be censored. I'm not going to take your point at this time, later in the speech. All right. Now, the next argument they bring up is about the denying the students a specific type of identity, basically saying they can't explore these options. There's nothing about censorship that prevents these students from exploring these options, or nothing from censorship that prevents them from going to other forums to exercise their freedom of speech. In fact, if we deny a student from talking about a certain issue, that might inspire curiosity and ensure that the student goes research the topics on their own and then go write for a different forum or go speak in front of people in a different forum. Therefore, we can't necessarily say that we're denying the students of identity. It's absolutely not true, which means that they can't link into this impact of dehumanization because we aren't denying this. Furthermore, you also have to cross-apply our first contention today of talking about how, we have different societal mechanisms in schools to ensure education, but at that same time, we aren't denying the identity of students. For example, for students, you can't just, cuss out your teacher, for example. Are we limiting freedom of speech? Absolutely. But at that same time, it's still beneficial to the educational institution to teach students. And furthermore, by students not being allowed to cuss out their teachers, are they really losing their identities? Absolutely not. They're trying to garner a huge impact off a very weak link. Alright, now let's move on to this other argument about the pressures that are changing the opinions of students. Now, a lot of these students, first of all, are very opinionated, meaning that they aren't necessarily going to conform to everything the teacher says. And second of all, you can cross-apply the other arguments I bring about crossing forums and more curiosity. Now, the next argument they bring up is basically the schools are going to be, the schools are really delegitimizing activity because we need to have an academic form of research, basically for people to consider the opinions of others. Now, we can still do this in other forms, cross-apply all those arguments to these different contentions. And although I agree that journalism is academic form, you can have an academic form that's not necessarily encompassing of all ideas and all thoughts and all opinions. Because journalism, some school newspapers are censored in certain aspects, that doesn't mean what they're already talking about right now isn't legitimate. That doesn't mean that what they're already talking about in those slightly censored school newspapers aren't encompassing of an academic form, a form where students can really research everything they want about those specific topics. Limiting the number of topics doesn't mean it's no longer an academic form. Don't confuse these issues. Okay, now let's move on to the next argument about censorship is cyclical. They're basically saying that we're trying to avoid public backlash, and there's basically no bright line. So basically, there's no bright line between what students can publish and what students cannot publish. However, there is a bright line because when we look at other rights of students, for example, there's a bright line when it comes to the safety of the masses. This is very important for certain rights, such as the right to privacy, for example, where at our high school we do have cameras. We have cameras on campus. Now, you can argue that hers are freedom to privacy, but at that same time, even if we do have cameras, that stops certain things like vandalism and underage drinking in the school parking lots, for example. So what this means is that there is a bright line for rights in the aspects of schools, and at the same time, when they conceded the argument that we can have restrictions on freedom of speech, the cyclical argument, they're contradicting themselves, because if they agree that certain rights can be restricted by a little bit, this doesn't mean that by saying no, that you can't say fire in a crowded theater, that does not necessarily mean that all the other aspects of freedom of speech are necessarily being restricted. They concede to this, which means that that's an argument for our own side, that we can restrict certain aspects of journalism but not completely restrict journalism as an entity, which therefore means that censorship is not cyclical. They provide an example that suggests that we've had this rule in place for a very long time and we haven't had additional censorship in place. Now the third argument they bring up about how it self-regulates, basically saying choice is eliminated, basically saying choice is limited, they can't write what they want. It's not self-regulating because if we don't have the school censoring, how can we ensure ethical journalism? Cross-apply the argument. Now, the two contentions we bring up that were never refuted by the other side, one, we're talking about societal mechanism, how it relates to the Constitution, and the purpose of the school, and two, is targeting specific people, and how that relates to an educational environment. Extend all those arguments, they're never falling the other side, that definitely hurts the education of these students. For all these reasons, be a clear vote for negation.
Four? Alright.
Billy, I think so. 4?
Yes. Cool. The next one's fine.
Alright, you guys ready?
Yes.
Alright. So the voters' issues for this round. First, they concede to this idea that freedom of speech should be limited in some manner by saying that, yes, you shouldn't be allowed to yell fire in a crowded theater. Also, by not attacking the idea we bring up, or contention we bring up in my first contention, that the school should operate as an institution that has the goal of creating an environment of learning, an environment of education. They're conceding that the goal of the school isn't necessarily to uphold freedoms or the freedom of speech in every single instance. So, on top of that, we show how censorship protects this environment of learning. We show that in our case by giving the examples of, hey, this is where censorship would be good for protecting the environment of learning. One, we talk about how students can't cuss out teachers. Students shouldn't be allowed to cuss out teachers in newspapers either. That's a limitation, that's a censorship on the newspaper that we think is good for the environment of learning. Another censorship that's good for the environment of learning would be if there's like some racial tensions in schools and a student writes, oh, I blame this certain race, or or something like that. That's an instance that would be bad, obviously, for that school and for that school environment of education, and yet if you didn't have any censorship, that student could easily write that. Other examples of where it's good to regulate censorship because it provides that environment of learning is students can make up quotes under the certain California system. My partner talks about how at my school in newspapers they just make up quotes, and how there's non-ethical journalism going on right now. With censorship, you can create that ethical aspect of journalism, and you can achieve that environment of learning without hurting over the long run. Actually improving over the long run that the learning aspect and communication skills of the student, because they learn how to do good journalism, and then when they grow up, they have no restrictions on that journalism, and so they can exercise or limited restrictions on that journalism, and so they can exercise that, and they can exercise that freedom in a manner where they have developed these ethical means, and where they have developed knowing not to make up quotes and things like that. Then the idea that self-regulation is a perfect solvency, we think, is totally wrong. Self-regulation isn't going to stop all these things that we talk about, because students have their opinions and they're opinionated, and they're not just going to change their ways for that. Then, on top of that, an argument that we think is strong. To respond to their first contention, an argument that they think is strong in the debate is that you're limiting their communication skills. However, we provide many examples of how kids can have other means to communicate, and how their impact coming off this is much, much too small, and how you should look at the impacts we bring of how the school should weigh this educational aspect and should create that environment, and how those impacts matter than just this small limitation to communication. These students can still learn to communicate. They can still write in their forums, and they can write in blogs, and they can write in underground newspapers, and they can write in local newspapers, and they can be passionate. And my partner even talks about how they can be more passionate because they were censored in one manner. Communication skills are not limited in any aspect at all, and so you shouldn't be voting off that. Where you should be voting is that schools don't operate under the freedom of speech, that schools have a separate rule book. And that rule book, as we show, already limits privacy, already limits wearing Nazi symbols and drug symbols and drugs and things like that. And we think that limitation should be expanded to the newspaper so that kids can't cuss out teachers in the newspaper, so that kids can't write about these racial things that would cause conflict and things like that. Those are adequate limitations to censorship, and that's why we stand on a strong vote on the negation. Thank you.
Okay. 5 minutes, right?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Then let's get started. So I'm just going to spend my final speech going over voter issues and clearing up a few main issues that have come up in this debate. So before I go into our voters, I'd like to talk about what the negation has talked to you about in their block. Now, first off, they brought up some argument, and Nick brought up some new arguments in his MOC, so even though this is a rebuttal speech, I will be responding to those since it is my first chance to do so. First off, he brought up how when these students are censored now, that's somehow going to inspire curiosity, and it's going to increase the likelihood of them researching elsewhere. Now, my main response to this is that when you're censoring students in their primary way of being published, in their primary method of being published, you're decreasing the likelihood of them trying to study in that way. My second major response is that it trains them in a censorship way. What this does is we're training them from a young age that what they are writing is always going to be censored, and so we're making it so that their pieces in the future are much more likely to be less controversial and have less of a political stance, which is decreasing their ability to be solid communicators and hurting their education overall. Now, moving on to the voter issues that Reed brought up today. First off, he told you that some censorship was okay in schools, and now the reason that some censorship is okay in schools is because we're assuming that that censorship there would otherwise be harm that comes along with that would be there without this censorship. So what that argument is based on is it's based on the assumption that these newspapers would be causing harm if they were not censored. So that's really an argument that is circular in nature. And in addition, they talked about how schools, their goal is education, and that what we're going to be seeing in this debate is that every one of the affirmations arguments is still linked to education, while the arguments of the negation are pretty much all defense. So moving on to the voters of the affirmation, the first voter issue is going to be coming off of our first contention and looking at preparing students to become better communicators. We've seen a lot of clash over this issue today. The negation is trying to tell you that they're going to be better training these students because students will get involved with other events more. But what we're seeing is that Shay brought up in her speech that we need to be allowing students to participate in the events that they want to participate in without censorship, and they never responded to this point. What this means is that they have conceded that they are taking away the autonomy of these students to choose their own activities, which is hurting them overall and hurting their education. So what we're seeing here is that when the goal of these learning institutions is education, we are clearly linking to improving the equality of education. In addition, if we want to talk about the legitimacy of newspapers, which has become a bit of an issue, they tried to say that censored newspapers can still be legitimate. In my opinion, most people don't consider Pravda to be all that legitimate a newspaper. If they want to contest that, they can. Overall, what we're seeing here is that when you have a newspaper that has been completely censored, a lot of people think that it is a lot less trustworthy because they know that the opinions that they are going to be getting from it are completely one-sided. Overall, we're going to be improving the quality of students as communicators and benefiting their education. The second main voter issue for the affirmation is on the issue of freedom of speech. Now, even though this was something that didn't as completely link to education, overall we're seeing that we're improving the rights of these students, and in addition to that, we're making it so that they are better able to improve their own quality of life. They tried to tell you that this ban should be weighed solely on education, but they never actually contested the full value criterion of net benefits. They just said that we should primarily factor in education, but when they're still taking away the rights of these students to speak and write what they want, that's hurting them overall. Now, the third and final main voter issue was on the third contention on the entire issue of incentives and self-regulation. Now, the negation has tried to say that if these newspapers aren't censored, there's automatically going to be a bunch of personal attacks popping up in these newspapers, and it's going to be harmful. But they never actually told you why self-regulation wouldn't apply. You see that these students have the ability, if they wanted to, they could post on these other blogs that they hate these teachers, that they could do any of that. They could post on Facebook, but there's a lot of self-censorship. And so what we're really seeing here is that students don't want to post these things, and they won't want to write these things and publish these things because they know that the community as a whole would not accept that, and it would hurt them in the long run. They're being censored by themselves overall, and in addition, our subpoints B about the choice and knowing what's right and wrong being eliminated, they completely drop that. What that means is that they can see that we're taking away the ability of these students to know what is right and what is wrong when it comes to publishing and writing offensive material. So when they take that away, they're eliminating the ability of students to discern what is offensive and not, and thus hurting education. So for all these reasons, we are proud to affirm. Thank you.
Thank you.
I finished your pet project for you.
Is it burger?
What?
What?
Sorry, what's your last name?
Chang?
Chang. What is
Burger?
Oh, I think I know another shape whose name is Burger.
Okay.
Should like a burger.
I could use a burger right now. Sounds
You
good.
just need a taco.
Thought he said like, would you like a burger?
I would like one. Like, what, 2 more pounds today?
Oh, yeah.
Why do these speech
Did we get
times
breaks?
all funky?
Like an hour break. I'm actually missing like regular tournaments where you have giant break between rounds.
Well, I'm sorry for running smoothly and efficiently.
How dare you?
You gonna show me a picture?
This is like, I'll never complain about long wait times in between rounds again.
I'm sure you'll confirm.
I think we may have shown it backwards,
Sure.
which is a bummer.
Well, it depends what time of the day it is.
I've decided.
I've already decided, I'm just
Oh.
writing notes and I'm gonna talk to him about.
Cool.
So, yeah.
Do you want to record the RFDs or should I turn it off right now?
Oh, I don't care, that's
Fine.
fine. It's up to you.
Cool. We'll keep it up.
You wanna go, I'll go first?
Oh, you can go first.
Yeah, more, probably different points. Okay, in this fight, I went for the AF, just to let you know, and then I'll bring up some points that came up. Granted, I didn't believe in the AF's case, but you guys didn't present a great case yourself, and you didn't actually attack the points that could have been attacked. And you were a little scattered in how it all came about. Self-censorship, come on. Kids self-censoring themselves in a school newspaper. And the thing is, maybe you're thinking college newspaper, but you should have brought up the fact that, okay, there's newspapers in grade school, middle school, even in high school. And in those papers, there has to be a censorship. And you could have brought up the fact that every major newspaper has an editor that censors those people. So all papers are censored. And the people that are investing in those newspapers are censoring them to put newspapers certain ways. It's gone beyond the part of newspaper being non-prejudicial. They can go to the left, Democratic, they can go to the right, Republican. It depends on your paper or everything else. So every paper needs censorship, and you guys could have done that and forced their hand there. You brought up a point about increased communication by writing skill. I mean, come on, you got students correcting other students. Well, yeah, okay, it could be an AP student, but still, there could be issues there. And that's what the teachers are there to promote and educate you guys into writing better. That's another point that could have been attacked.
Thank you, sir.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I didn't do points.
Oh, points, yes.
Okay, again, if it would have been certain points, like attacking teachers, you should have drug on to that point. Yeah, they can badmouth teachers, but then, you could have tied in the part about the lockers. You're in a school institution, you're in a state institution. There's rules and regulations, and student rights, they don't have rights when they're in the school system. Because, like you've said in your very beginning, you said that the teacher takes on the role of the parent. So therefore, you should erode that a little further in saying that, okay, you're as a parent and as a underaged minor. And also the Constitution was written for adults, not underage minors. You could have erode that a little further. So, with state and everything else coming up, these are things you might keep in mind. Because there was a lot of ways that you could have attacked that. I thought that was when I read it, I go, okay, this is a neg case. The neg should have this one, but unfortunately it was just too scattered for me. Sorry, go ahead. Did I miss something?
Well, one of you did something bad because you have your app and negative teams backwards of each other. So I just want to make absolutely clear.
Foltz and Chang.
Oh, jeez, that's me.
Foltz and Chang should be off, right?
Yes.
Can I just scratch here?
Oh yeah, you just scratch out their names and.
Actually, can I do it this way? Or are you gonna get confused?
No, it's gonna get confusing for
Okay.
Jim again if you could just rewrite
Scratch
the names.
the names.
Yeah. And make sure the points are.
I'm used to sending everybody a certain way. I knew I
Yeah.
should.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, we could have.
No, it was my fault. It was my fault. It's just.
Oh, your fault.
It must be.
It's okay. This is
See, there was
really
nobody
common
to
with
censor
points
me,
of browse.
guys.
That's the problem.
The reason we have coin flips is because the Joe tournament software sucks at assigning signs. So we just ignore what it says.
Okay, now it's right. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Whoa, Artem took his glasses.
Okay. Valid observation. Oh, am I going?
Yeah, sure.
Cool. Alright,
Oh.
so, two things before the RFD. First thing is that I'm hoping that you guys in future rounds do a much better job signposting. Signposting, the way you both guys are signposting is like, now go to the argument that says this, but you guys never like give me a number, and that makes my life very hard because I have them. Because the arguments are fairly similar, and it ends up getting smushed together on my flow. This is like the worst flow I've ever had.
Did I do okay with that in the PMC?
PMC was slightly easier to follow, but even
Okay.
there, I think it's just difficult because nobody's numbering stuff. Second thing is that this is just generally true for free speech rounds, right? If you have a free speech round, people will be able to bring up all sorts of exceptions when like free speech is misused. And if your only offense is just like, oh, free speech is key to our humanities and makes us feel warm inside, it creates a problem because if I weigh that against things like bullying or character assassination, it makes things really hard for you. So you need to delve a lot deeper into like reasons why free speech was instituted originally, which is something that you actually brought up at the very beginning, saying that free speech is necessary for the exercise of other rights. Specifically, like, we don't know that school administrators would be censoring newspapers to prevent legitimate bullying versus censoring newspapers because they say the school administrator sucks at his job or her job, right? So like, the reason why we even need free speech is to like allow students or anybody else to like critique misuse of power, and if you don't bring that up, then it's really hard to get like net benefits out of anything. That being said, I'm also voting app, and I agree with a lot of what you said. Because I'm voting AF because I think that the self-censorship argument, again, somewhat of a stretch, but you guys are just undercovering it. And in particular, you're undercovering the subpoint on self-censorship that I just have flowing through, which talks about like public reaction, right? So they're saying, if a kid posts some stupid, mean article, all the other very responsible students will be like, no, that was clearly inappropriate, and then the kid will feel sad and grow up to be a responsible adult. So the reason why I think that matters in the round is that if that's true, then that is a very significant mitigation of any impacts that you're garnering from like bullying, teacher calling out and stuff like that. And you still have a bit of offense left there, but that mitigated offense, I think, can be outweighed by things like free speech. It's just right, and it's dehumanizing to not have it, and all these like sort of vague impacts. I'm giving to them because I'm weighing those vague impacts against very highly mitigated impacts on your side. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. So like my question is like, this sounds very simple, but like how do you explain that like the students wouldn't care about self-regulating themselves?
In this case, this was just this was very simple for me. This was just a case of like dropped argument. So it's not that you like didn't explain it well.
Yeah,
it's just
no,
you
I
didn't talk
understand that,
about it.
but like if we were to explain that argument, would we just say that like, oh, the students don't care about each other? Like, that sounds very...
Right. So like I think what the thing you should really said is like bullying, and bullying tends to be a phenomenon where like the majority of students are bullying a minority. And in that case, any public reaction would be, yeah, we all agree that Latinos are horrible, right? So I don't think like public reaction by students is always a good check, especially in cases of bullying.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
All right.
Cool.
Good.
All right, good run.
One more thing, because you will hit this subject again, either this year or next year or whenever in your life. They are actually censoring Facebook and stuff now, schools. And as a part of, I know Lodi Unified School District, they actually have each parent and student sign a waiver saying that they will not be bullying and posting it, and if they will, they'll be suspended or expelled. So they are doing that on Facebook and other texts because bullying is such a big part, and they did Facebook and bully that one girl that was back east, and she ended up killing herself.
Amanda Todd.
There was two of them. I think there was two cases like that.
Evergreen the administration forces students to take down the Evergreen Facebook confessions page in case somebody can post something mean on there.
Alright, well,
So yeah,
thank you
it's,
very much. Yeah, Joe.
I thought Arlen doesn't shake hands.
well, now it's videotaped.
Thank you.
And, oh, by the way, this is like backward.
Yeah, it's a